Good afternoon. This panel is Dismantling Imperial Narratives with Filomeno Aguilar, Lisandro Claudio, and Patricia May B. Jurilla. There are three historians who show how history writing and take down imperial narratives in the specific areas of the economy, of identity and migration, and of books and publishing. Filomeno Aguilar is Professor of History and Assistant Vice President for Research, Creative Work, and Innovation at Ateneo de Manila University. He received the Grant Goldman Prize in Historical Studies from the Philippine Studies Committee, Association for Asian Studies, in March 2025. His most recent book is Jose Rizal, Nationhood and the Anti-Colonial Imagination, which was published this year. Lisandro Claudio is Associate Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also Chair of the Center for Southeast Asia Studies. His work has been awarded the George Cahan Prize by the Association of Asian Studies and the European Association for Southeast Asian Studies Book Prize for the Humanities. His most recent book is The Profligate Colonial: How the United States Exported Austerity to the Philippines. Patricia May B. Jurilla, PhD, is a professor of the University of the Philippines in Diliman, where she teaches book history and literature. The first formally trained Filipino book historian, she has authored various books and articles on Philippine printing and publishing. Lisandro Claudio has an introduction to their talk that we'll begin with.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Magandang hapon. So this panel is about dismantling imperial narratives. And I guess one way we thought of doing this was to approach a famous quote about the Philippines and try to deconstruct this quote. The quote is, the summary of Philippine history according to this quote is that the country spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. So 300 years with the Spanish as represented by the convent, and then 50 years in Hollywood as represented by America. It's very witty, of course, and there's a reason why everybody says it, because it captures a lot of Philippine history in a nice pithy statement. But of course, as with every pithy statement, it obviously lacks nuance. And we're going to try to nuance this quote through this panel. We're going to look at it from very different perspectives. I'm going to try to do it through economics. I think May is a book historian, and Jun Aguilar, of course, his new book is about Jose Rizal, and I wonder if he's going. And you know, Jose Rizal is always a nice way to look at the history of the Philippines. So I think Aurora will begin.
Sorry, Lelo, I will not actually be talking about Rizal. When we think about 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood, it really tries to capture, as you said, the fact that the Philippines was twice colonized. 300 years under Spain and 50 years under the United States. And we can look at it in terms of the dramatic changes from Spanish to American rule, but also in terms of continuities from Spain to US rule. So that's, of course, the usual approach of historians. But I'd like to say that in terms of religious movements, what is interesting, because after all, it says 300 years in the convent. What I find interesting is that in the 300 years under Spanish rule, what we observed were peasant millenarian movements that tried to subvert and appropriate the symbols of the Catholic Church. But these movements were all led by peasants. And at that time, there was no separation of church and state. In contrast, under American rule, there was now officially a separation of church and state. You no longer have peasants imitating the church, but what happened with the introduction of different Protestant denominations is that there were several key individuals that became members of Protestant churches introduced by the US, and then they span off into their own churches that ironically did not follow church and state separation. This example really comes from the Iglesia ni Cristo. because Manalo, who started the Iglesia Ni Cristo, became a member of the Seventh-day Adventist, and in fact, he followed the very physical structure of the church, but just added a spire. And so you can see how from the Adventist church, Manalo then had a model. Oh, this is how you create a church. This type of modeling was not available under Spanish rule because there was only one church. But the interesting thing is that from Manalo all the way to the present, you find Kibuloy, who is very controversial, also attending a Protestant church and a Protestant seminary, and then setting up his own church. Also, not recognizing church-state separation, because from the Iglesia Ni Cristo to Kibuloy's church, these groups have been so closely intertwined with politicians and with interfering in politics. So this is the paradoxical child of the freedom of religion under US rule. Okay, so that's one set of comments. The other set of comments is that it may not seem obvious. We might assume that the Philippines had always existed since time immemorial, but that is the primordialist view. It was actually Spain that provided the context in which this group of islands out there in the Pacific began to see itself as one entity. So Philippine nationalism was actually born under the aegis of Spanish colonialism. Now, what did US do? The United States officially tried to nurture nationalism officially, but what the US really contributed is that it defined the boundaries of the Philippines. Because prior to that, Las Islas Filipinas under Spain was also directly involved in the Pacific Islands, the Marianas, the Carolines, which were governed from Manila. After the US takeover of the Philippines, Mindanao was now clearly a part of the Philippines. So you have under US rule clearly Luzon, the central islands of the Visayas, and then Mindanao. So the US defined this territory. At the same time, the US also began to formally support, inadvertently, regionalism. And here I begin to talk not so much about the Visayas or other parts of the Philippines, but about the Bicol region where I come from. The very notion of Bicol did not exist in the mid-19th century. Bicol was simply a small district in the province of Camarines Sur. And then it began to expand around 1848 to something like maybe some parts of Camarines Sur, but it was still not region-wide. The very idea of Bicol was actually created in the context of US rule, where the school systems that were developed began to develop a sense of Bicol identity, the Bicol organizations indicating a regional association, students moving from Naga City to Legazpi and vice versa. They were all trying to create now a sense of Bicol identity, which is very much the invention of US rule, under the context of US colonialism. So I will stop here, and if you have any questions, we'll pursue that later.
So thank you very much, everyone. I want to deal with the second part of the quote, which is 50 years in Hollywood. And of course, that's inadequate for two reasons. Of course, the left in the Philippines is going to say that's inadequate because there is such a thing as neocolonialism. And so in that sense, it's not just 50 years. The standard left-wing discourse in the Philippines, especially from the Maoist left, is that all presidents of the Philippines are effectively clients of the United States, and they call this neocolonialism. Of course, you can argue with that, but what you can't argue is the fact that there is definitely still US interest in the Philippines. But what I'm more interested in, apart from geopolitical questions, is actually intellectual questions. I think in terms of neocolonialism, that is most evident in the way Filipinos think. And it's hidden in many respects, and I'm going to show that today using the case study of economics. Because my contention is that most Filipinos, actually almost all Filipinos from the left to the right, they think like US Republican bankers from the late 19th century. both the Maoists and the Central Bank of the Philippines. They think exactly like the progressive era Republicans of the 19th century. The second problem, of course, with this Hollywood metaphor is that it's superficial because Hollywood is just entertainment. But what I argue, and if I can make a plug in my new book, The Profligate Colonial, How the United States Exported Austerity to the Philippines, is that the deep macroeconomic structures of the Philippines are still effectively American. They are from the progressive era of the United States. And you don't need formal power for the US to impose this on the Philippines. This has been internalized by Filipinos themselves, such that Filipinos, both on the left and the right, are austere. And so I want to talk about this. I want to begin this story by talking about an interview I had with the economics journalist of the New York Times. So I told him that in the Philippines, the central bank does not have a development. Usually in most central banks have two functions. One is to maintain price stability, the other one is development. Right? There's no developmental function in the Philippine Central Bank. The Philippine Central Bank is the most conservative central bank in Asia. It raises interest rates more than any other central bank, and it guards the price of the peso like Smaug in The Hobbit, in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. And when I told the New York Times reporter about this kind of quirk of the Philippine Central Bank, he told me something interesting. He said, "You guys are the Germans of Asia then." And I find it interesting that I am giving this talk here, of course, in Frankfurt, where you have the Bundesbank, the second most conservative central bank in the world, next only to the Philippine Central Bank, of course, which is number one, right? So we are German in that sense, in that we guard our currency very jealously. If you graph, for example, the history of the Philippine peso relative to the Vietnamese dong, it's a flat line, and the Vietnamese dong is this, right? So we've guarded our currency very preciously, and we're also the most aggressive rate hikers in Asia, which means it's a very austere central bank, and nobody questions it because nobody speaks the language of macroeconomics. And in fact, the left has punted on this question because the left actually agrees with the central bank. So for example, 3 years ago, when the peso bottomed out at roughly 57 pesos to $1 US, the central bank vowed that it would stabilize the peso. And the Maoists claimed that the government should stabilize the peso. So it was a left-right consensus. And in this sense, we are actually worse than the Germans. Because at least Die Linke would never agree with the Bundesbank. But in the Philippines, the Communist Party of the Philippines agrees with the central bank that you should protect the price of the peso. It is in this sense, I think, the most macroeconomically bizarre country in the world, where you have a left-right consensus on high interest rates and keeping the peso expensive. And it is a very difficult story to tell. I said, I want to tell the story of how we ended up becoming so bizarre. And I thought it would just be a journal article, but I needed an entire book to tell the story. But the short story is this. The short story is that when the Americans arrived in the Philippines, the Americans who arrived in the Philippines were almost all Republicans because they had just beaten the Democrats in elections in the United States. And the biggest debate in the US at that time economically was gold versus silver. So in other words, hard money, expensive money versus silver. The Republicans won. And when they came to the Philippines, they believed that they should impose the values of gold on a profligate people, the Filipinos. Right? So imagine the equivalent would be if Donald Trump's crypto bros today colonized the Philippines. That's effectively what happened in the 19th century in the Philippines, and that became a mainstay of all economics in the Philippines. And then the more interesting story is why even the left adopted that discourse. The short answer is that, unfortunately, the only president to really challenge the strong peso ideology in the Philippines turned out to be a dictator and turned out to be very corrupt. His name was Ferdinand Marcos. And as a result of that, because the way the left defines itself in the Philippines is anything Marcos did is the opposite of what we want, they ended up defending the strong peso as well. And so you get a very bizarre scenario in the Philippines where the left and the right think not just like German central bankers, they think like American Republicans from the 19th century. And this is the story I wanted to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Patricia.
I'm going to take back the conversation, go back to the convent, away from the banks, and a little bit of Hollywood. From the point of view of history, there's no lack of effort in Philippine book history of books trying to dismantle the narratives, the imperial narratives, or criticizing it at least, resisting, circumventing it. There is Rizal, of course. Everyone knows Rizal, that actually dismantled not only the narrative, but the structures that propped up this narrative. But I'd like to talk about 3 books that operated not in plain sight, as it were, and that I think will give a quick preview of the convent and Hollywood in our history. The first one is the first book authored by a native, as early as 1610. Do note that the printing was introduced in the Philippines in 1593. And the first book authored by a native, 1610, was called Librong Pag-aaralan ng mga Tagalog ng Wikang Kastila, the book by which Tagalogs can learn Castilian. And it was by Tomas Pinpin, who was a printer, and he would become the most famous printer of the early Spanish colonial period. So just the title alone, it seems to sound like he's completely complying with the Spanish order and teaching his fellow Tagalogs to speak Spanish and to seem Spanish. In fact, he has a famous quote there about you imitate them in their dress and in their manner. Why not learn their language and actually sound like them? But actually, it's not so unambiguous in its purpose. Consider, Spain's policy was not to teach the natives the languages. And this was by law. So here was Pinpin taking it upon himself to do so for his fellow Filipinos, for fellow Tagalogs at least. And then Pinpin's book was printed actually with a guide for confession. And one of the reasons he wrote this book, he says to his readers, is that he wanted them to make good confessions. Now, he says, this is very clear in his book, but he does not say if he meant good as in earnest, sincere, truly penitent, or good as in good enough to comply with a requirement, good enough to, just to say one's sins in Spanish and not be berated by the priest, get the ritual over and done with, and maybe even getting an easy penance. Since then, scholars have already determined, have surmised that Pinpin wrote his book not entirely out of admiration for the Spaniards or subservience to the Spanish authorities, but actually as a safety vest. Vicente Rafael says, to Pinpin and other Tagalogs, to understand Spanish was to be able to anticipate and thus defer to Castilian in the interest of warding off the threat of a violent and undecipherable return. A more recent scholar, Damon Wood, said, Pinpin's book is ultimately subversive in nature, with a single agenda of helping Tagalogs survive in a marketplace dominated and controlled by the Spaniards. So you can see the efforts at dismantling as early as 1610. The second book, I'll fast forward a few hundred years. It's called Pinagdaanang Buhay ni Florante at ni Laura sa Kahariang Albania, The History of Florante and Laura in the Kingdom of Albania, by Francisco Baltasar, or Balagtas as he is also known. This was published in 1838. This is a metrical romance of Florante at Laura in Albania, as exotic as Albania seemed to 19th century Filipinos. And the metrical romance was the most popular literary form of the entire Spanish colonial period. And it was in the 18th centuries and 19th centuries that Filipinos actually began composing their own versions. And it was wild. It was princes in Ireland, dukes in Majorca, but carrying baskets on the head with very native elements because they had no sense of what was Europe. But anyhow, this one stood out of the hundreds written, and this has lasted, and it is still in print today, because as it was not just a love story, an adventure story, a very Christian story, but Balagtas specifically mentioned in his preface that there's something underneath here. And so it has been read as actually a depiction of the sufferings of the Filipino people during the Spanish colonial regime, as metrical romances go, plus with a melodramatic flair of Filipinos' long suffering of Florante to get to his love, forbidden love, and all of these things that come into metrical romance. But given that, that a couple of lines only that he suggests there's something here. It has been read as a depiction of specifically the Spanish regime, because this was also a book that was promoted during the American administration, during the American occupation. It is now thought that Balagtas used a very popular form and to get past the strict censorship of the time. And he wanted to make social statement. So that's my second book of the convent. Hollywood. Now Hollywood. That doesn't seem so, but this is a little known book, and it's called Ang Lumang Simbahan, The Old Church, by Francisco T. Collantes. This was actually a narrative poem presumed to have been published in the magazine sometime in the second half of the 1920s. I can't trace it anymore because there are no records. I have come across no records. So, Ang Lumang Simbahan is about an old church in a sad little town, and the church is decrepit, supposedly haunted, and it would be the site of young lovers, a Romeo and Juliet-ish kind of love, forbidden love, parents against their love. So they decide to go to the old church and just do themselves in and end their lives. But very practical, they decide to dig a hole and for their grave, so they fall into their graves in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary. But remember, the church has been neglected. It is falling apart, haunted supposedly. No one goes there, and the town is just fallen apart nearly because of that also, that center, what used to be the center. So anyhow, as the lovers try to pursue their suicide plan with the digging of the graves, what do they find? Treasure, gold. And suddenly their minds change. And no longer shall they end their lives, but they bring out this gold to the community. The restoration of the church follows. Everyone is happy. They bring it back to its glory. And this town is revived. And the former community comes together. And it's very clear, 1920s, and here is a celebration of, a plea for a return of the old church, the old Spanish regime, the religion, lost or being dissipated already by American education, American culture, and all. Now, this work is particularly, I think, interesting in this whole Hollywood convent thing, also the narratives. It's aside from the cultural, religious, and political statement it carries, the Hollywood element specifically about this is it was made into a silent movie in 1927, one of the earliest movies, not the first, but it was a silent movie. And for book historians, it's particularly interesting because it was published as a novel in 1928. With the title specifically saying based on the poem of the same title. Okay? And then the novel had film stills from printed along with it. So it's fantastic. It's the first movie novel tie-in I've ever encountered in my research, and something quite remarkable aside from the political content it offers. But it also tells you economically, religiously, things shifting in the 1920s, and not an outright criticism of the American regime and American ways, but certainly a nostalgia, kind of, I don't know, bringing back of the, and religious also, because of that old church, bringing back that old church, going back to religion, as it were. So those three things, there are more, but there's not enough time, and this is not the place for that, but maybe you'll find it in our new books, further under the radar, moments of resistance, questioning, circumvention. I think the most interesting is circumvention. Metrical romances seemingly plain and innocuous, and then you have something there. Okay.
So, sure.
Thanks. In terms of this changeover from Spain to the US, there is one aspect of Philippine history that I think should be also emphasized, which historians hardly study. It is the law, the legal system. And I myself have not looked into that. But under Spain, civil law was introduced in the Philippines, but under the US, it is the common law that was introduced into the Philippines. So you have actually two types of systems introduced into the Philippines by two different colonial powers, and both systems, if you like, the Philippine legal system is twice removed from the local culture because it was never really embedded. Civil law is based on the Napoleonic idea of a code, and up to now, the law is still that governs domestic relations, for instance, is still based on the code, a civil law. But we have a Supreme Court that follows the common law but does not follow the jury system. So the Philippines is considered a very unique hybrid type of legal system, but in both cases, very much, if you like, alienated from indigenous culture. And so, which is why we can come up with different types of laws. And it's the lawmakers who know how best to manipulate them. Thank you.
Can we open the floor to questions from the audience? Does anyone have a question? At the moment? Okay, so maybe I'll ask one that kind of steps back from some of the details of history a little bit. The colonial sort of legacy of the Philippines still continues to drive the way Filipinos think of themselves to this day. What would you say is the most insidious imperial narrative that continues into modern day Philippines, and also the most urgent to dismantle? Lelo,
I think I already said that the legacy of the strong currency, sorry. And I think it's urgent to dismantle the legacy of the strong currency because it impoverishes the country. As long as we don't depreciate the peso, we don't invest in our exports, we privilege imports that don't really make us money. And then we have this Dutch disease of having OFWs. We send them away. And that's how we get foreign exchange. Or if you just depreciated the currency and encourage exportation, we would be able to get foreign exchange without having to send away as many people as possible. Of course, that needs to be accompanied with industrial policy, with a government that is more active in terms of promoting local industry. But that's another kind of vestige of colonialism, because the United States was a highly conservative and austere colonizer. And our bureaucrats think that way as well, right? There's no idea. The active state is kind of anathema to our economic policymakers. And the problem, of course, is that Filipinos think that the biggest problem in the country is corruption, but there are other countries that got rich while being corrupt. Like China is extremely rich while being corrupt. The problem with the Philippines is not just corruption. It is also the fact that it's a very weak state economically, and this is a vestige not just of the United States, this is also a vestige of the Spaniards, who actually had zero macroeconomic policy because they let the British just take over the economy of the Philippines. The other thing that this narrative obscures, of course, is 300 years in the convent, 50 years in Hollywood, but actually, during the tail end of the Spanish administration, the Philippines was practically economically a British colony. 60% of our exports were going to London at this point. So that's what's obscured by this narrative, the kind of history of British imperialism in the Philippines, which also conditioned economic thinking in the country.
I am just going to say that whatever imperial narratives there were is now being dismantled not by us academics, but by OFWs. It's the overseas Filipinos who are showing that you can relate to the West on their own terms, engaging in the kind of honest labor that they do. So, Filipino elites may be saddled by imperial vestiges, but I believe that it is the overseas Filipinos that are showing the way. In my book called Migration Revolution, the whole notion of Philippine society and culture is actually being fundamentally subverted by overseas migration in many ways than one.
I'll just make a plug. That book is available through NUS Press. I think they're in one of the stands.
Patricia?
Yeah, for book history, the most insidious effect, that was your word, right? I think it's that we import more books than we produce them. And that has to do with language. And there's a long discussion to that, but we import more books than we produce local books in the Philippines.
Does anyone else have another question? Do you have a question for each other? Oh, there.
Hello. Maybe just as a response to your own question, most insidious, the hierarchy that we have. And when you spoke about how OFWs, I'm an OFW, how I see here in Europe, in Australia, there's no inherent, you're better because you're rich. That's so insidious in our country that if you speak as fluent as I can, for example, it's a status symbol. And you speak in a certain accent from a private school, is another status symbol. And the whole fact that people are paler, that's also another status symbol. We have so many status symbols about the cars we drive or the clothes we wear that I think we imported a lot from the colonial times. And I hope we get that out. But maybe, sorry, I know you will respond to this one. I also have a question on the economic side. I didn't know that it came from 19th century time that we have this obsession with the currency. I thought that was from the crisis from the 90s, where we got so afraid of losing the value of the peso that we started shoring it up with OFW remittances and gold. But maybe you can speak more about that too.
Yeah, there are two traumas related to the value of the currency, and there are two big economic crises. Of course, the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, which was tremendous. Do you know what the largest ever economic recession recorded in history was? Is the economic recession that occurred in Southeast Asia when Japan occupied Southeast Asia. That is the biggest recorded economic recession in world history. And yet nobody talks about it, right, in world history. And so it was very traumatic for Filipinos, especially because the currency at that time was super devalued. It's very, again, very German, right? So people would have what in the Philippines was called Mickey Mouse money, and they would carry the Mickey Mouse money in sacks to buy things, right? So it's very Weimar, actually, another similarity with the Germans. And then the next big trauma was, of course, 83, when the currency collapsed as a result of a lot of debt in the Philippines, but also the general third world debt crisis, which in Latin America was, of course, called La Década Perdida, or the lost decade, right? And so these two trauma periods, not so much the Asian financial crisis, reinforced already existing biases against a weak currency in the Philippines, such that we were never really able to depreciate our currency the way Korea did or the way Vietnam did, these high export-driven economies. I still think we can do it, especially nowadays, but it really takes a kind of bravery, and it takes real reforms. It takes moving away from the Bundesbank model and really thinking in Asian terms about developmental policy.
Can I respond?
Yes, of course.
There is inequality everywhere. there are class differences everywhere. But what is interesting about the Philippines is that the class differences must actually be emphasized, whereas, for instance, in other societies, people try to de-emphasize it. So what is interesting about the Philippines is that it must be asserted in every possible aspect of social life. And you know why that is the case? Because our middle classes, the ones that emerge, for instance, in my book, Clash of Spirits, looking into sugar production, the sugar planters came from very poor backgrounds. They were not elite. They acquired wealth in the late 19th century when the Philippines began to engage with global agriculture. So they were very insecure. Even those that were part Chinese and even those that were part European. The Spaniards who were involved in the sugar industry were former bureaucrats who gained some money through corruption, while they were in office, bought some small farms, but they were never big landlords, really. So they were very insecure. It is actually under the United States that sugar planters began to be supported with state funds. And then they began to be wealthy, pretending to be aristocratic. But deep inside, it is a very insecure elite class. And so because of its insecurity, it needs to assert itself. So which is why it's that kind of ideology has spread throughout society. And all of us ordinary Filipinos overseas and in the Philippines are very particular about class differences. But only because we have a very insecure, relatively new class that did not emerge out of a traditional class. Because the traditional elite, prior to colonialism, disappeared under Spanish rule because they could not cope with the demands of Spanish and the commercialization that began to occur around the late 18th century. And then when they were no longer in positions of social in a social position of prominence, what emerged from around 1848 was a class of Chinese mestizos, those natives intermarrying with migrant Chinese, who also have no aristocratic background within the Philippines. So you really have from both the case of the the Chinese mestizo, who are now all Filipinos. Rizal was a Chinese mestizo. So the Chinese mestizos gaining their wealth in the late 19th century, but being very insecure with no state support because Spain also did not have the funds to support them, and really finding ways to survive on their own, very much an insecure class. It was not supported by the state. They had to, in Negros, I show in my book, that they were trying to actually just to get labor for the sugar fields. They had to contravene state regulations on migrant labor within the Philippines. They did not have the support of the Spanish state. So this is the ideology that needs to be emphasized. Because, as I said to begin with, there's social inequality everywhere, but ours is distinct in that because of this double history of colonialism, we need to assert classness, accentuated, of course, by social media at the present age.
We have another question from...
Can I weigh in on the insecurity point? I mean, a lot of phenomena in the Philippines, I think, is really driven by various chips on the shoulder. I was thinking the other day, as I was preparing to prepare my bills for reimbursement for this trip, which I will inevitably file with the Philippine government, and it's going to be a very, very painful process because anybody who's dealt with the Philippine government knows that it has more forms than the Japanese, right? It's worse than the Japanese. And so why is it that Filipinos love forms, useless forms? And I was thinking, is it possible that it comes from the 19th century? Because in the 19th century, what the Spanish did was they educated a lot of Filipinos so that you had a lot of clerks in the Philippines. So you had a lot of educated clerks, but he didn't give these clerks any power because the power went to the Spanish. So what do you do when you have educated clerks who have no power and they want to assert power? They make forms because that's the way of asserting power, right? And I think there was a kind of path dependence there where these clerks who asserted power became the bureaucrats, and now it's very difficult to deal with the Philippine government. These clerks, of course, had two options. One, they could make forms. The other option was, and this also happened, they joined the Katipunan, became revolutionaries. So either you are burdening people with forms or you're becoming a revolutionary. It's a kind of pick your poison sort of thing when it comes to the 19th century in the Philippines.
On the point of clerks, there's several writers in the late 19th century who were clerks. Balagtas himself had some government position. And maybe that was where they exercised some artistic power. Yeah, but because of being in the educated class, they were. And then even up to the 20th century, even up to the 21st century, there are government officials who would have that an alternative literary life, as it were. So, yeah.
I mean, the form is a literary genre. In the bureaucratic form in the Philippines is actually a literary genre, right?
Yeah, could be. And could be the study of book history, sure.
May, you mentioned that actually we have, as a country, very limited production of literary works.
Books, yeah.
Yes, but that's not just for literature. It is also in scholarship, in academic, in scholarly article production. The Philippines lags behind Malaysia, even Indonesia, and certainly behind Singapore. But I think we need to be able to look into our relationship to the written word, because language for us has always been this way of strategizing through life, but never really to express our thoughts and ideas on paper, except for a very small elite. And so we find it hard as a people to write. We are not readers, we are not writers. And our whole education system does not make our students read, and it does not make them write. And so it is no wonder that we have very few titles here in Frankfurt compared to other countries that have exhibited here, because we don't read, we don't write. We don't read each other too.
Yeah.
So that is really, our relationship with the written word is very complex, and it is something that from which we are actually distant. We are not comfortable with the written word.
Yeah.
That is just how I feel about it, because we use language, and more than anything else, we really like to be able to speak. I don't know what under Spain and American rule makes us so particular about, oh, you did not pronounce that word properly. Oh, you don't say this word, you say it this way. Our imitation, it is at the oral level.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're not incorrect about our relationship with the written word and the pronunciation and all. But I'll take you back to the oral culture of what would become Las Islas Filipinas. And at heart, to this day, it continues. We are a performative nation. We see that in our politics. We see that in our practically all aspects of life. So that's why you will have a song and dance number in any Filipino gathering, and that is that's part of it. Pre-colonial Philippine society was literate, but that it was, writings were used for correspondence. Matters of religion, matters of law, literature were oral in tradition, and that continued on. I think that continues on to this day. Why so, and why to a lesser degree the written word? Might have to do exactly with class, language, education, and things like that. Complicated, but yeah, it's not given enough credit, I think, in literary circles, in academic circles. But we are the oral tradition is very strong in us. And so it might not produce books, might produce writings, but certainly that is how we express ourselves, we identify ourselves, we fight our battles, and we struggle also. Always that performative oral aspect. And now I think it's in social media. Memes suddenly, it just goes on, and TikTok. They have a whole new generation reacting and resisting or complying. So there's that aspect that which is very Asian, the oral tradition, which to this day I think you will find alive and kicking in the Philippines. So.
Which makes it doubly paradoxical that we have Rizal as a national hero, who is actually, as Carol High would say, who is not read. And even his impact was through orality. And we did a study of how his novels are being taught today in high school, and it's also largely, quote unquote, oral literature, partly because there are no textbooks in public schools. So they study the novels of Rizal through oral tradition, of course, through the teacher who talks about the novels, which they never read. So even now, it still is orality over literacy.
We have time for one more question, yes? Yeah, they'll bring over another. Sorry, she's asking a question there. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. It might sound a little reductive, but I'm interested to know, so Philippines has been to the convent and Philippines has been to Hollywood. Oh, sorry. It might be a bit reductive, but I'm interested to know just from your personal opinions. We've heard that Philippines has been to the convent and been to Hollywood. Where's Philippines now?
In the Hollywood convent.
In the convent of Hollywood. Somehow related.
Okay.
Yeah, so my question is related to hers. 30% of the economy is illicit. Okay? So this is a question for Liloy. Okay? 30% of the economy where Filipinos are is illicit, is not taxed. So how does that affect the program? But the other thing about where's the Filipino now, 14% of kids in Japanese public high schools have Filipino parents. The new concept of beauty now, of kawaii in Japan, is having a Japanese face and Filipino eyes. The other fascinating thing is when you line up in the Manila's immigration coming in, 30 years ago, you can hear somebody like Aurora, a California accent. But now, you line up, there's a Filipino kid speaks German to mom, another Arabic to dad, French, Norwegian, Japanese, and Thai. It's a very fascinating thing. So that is probably where it comes from. So my question is, one of the reasons really that this is not explored is the imperialism, not only of English, but of Tagalog. Okay? Filipino and English have completely neutralized and suppressed these different languages. So that, and then to go back to Liloy, which other section in the Philippines are people speaking 8 or 9 languages? Who are the results today? The results today are my favorite smugglers in the Philippine South, who speak 8 languages: Malay, the 3 Muslim languages, English, Tagalog, Filipino, and Hokkien. So if you want to dismantle the narrative, actually, you also have to dismantle the nation.
Yeah, we'll drink beer later. I just want to answer where we are now, and I think, like, in a way, the Philippines presents a way of dealing with colonialism that is a bit more comfortable and less precious with it than other places. I was thinking about this because in the United States, in our campus at Berkeley, they wanted to name all of the buildings that were named after colonizers of the Philippines because our campus was very involved in that process. And I supported the students until I thought that actually Filipinos don't care because we have Taft Avenue, we have Roosevelt Station, we have Forbes Park. The entire city is named with it's littered with names of our colonizers and we don't care. And that's something I like about Filipinos actually. We're not really precious about these things. We can kind of laugh about these things and accept these things. And that's, I think, the kind of beauty I was talking about earlier about our chip on our shoulder. But in certain respects, we don't have a chip on our shoulder. And that's, I don't know if that describes the present, but that's something I like about the Philippines. 30% illicit. I think that the number, that doesn't count the fact that a lot of Filipinos now, OFWs, are giving their credit cards to Filipinos, American credit cards to Filipinos in the Philippines and say, spend this money because I don't want to get taxed by Donald Trump through remittances. So it's actually growing, and neither the Philippine state nor the American state can sequester these dollars. And so, and that is interesting, and this is why we need industrial policy again, because once you have industrial policy, you can sequester some of that money.
Okay, that's time for this talk. Thank you so much for the panelists and the audience for participating.